It was the late afternoon of a humid summer day in Mexico City when Rafael Pérez climbed into the cockpit of his small aircraft, preparing for what should have been a routine training flight. He was a student pilot, eager, ambitious, pride brimming in his chest as he strapped into the controls, ran through his pre-flight checklist, and watched the runway stretch out before him under the pale sky. Around him, the hum of engines, the laughter of ground crew, the distant drone of traffic, all were familiar. But Rafael, even then, would never again consider any flight the same. Takeoff was textbook. The plane left the runway with clean lift, his hands steady over throttle and instruments. He reported to tower, climbing, heading on course, altitude rising, everything normal. As he passed through several thousand feet, he marveled at the view, the undulating ridges of the land, roads cutting lines through fields, the haze pressing faint blue dimensions to the horizon. He felt confident, focused. But somewhere beyond those clouds, something waited. It began subtly. The first sign was the controls becoming just a bit less responsive, slight resistance when he adjusted the yoke, a subtle sluggishness in roll response. Rafael frowned. He glanced at instrument readouts, all normal. He radioed ground control to verify instructions, confirming his bearing. But as he spoke, a faint, almost imperceptible static crept into his headset, distorting his voice for an instant. He paused mid-sentence. His heart skipped. He pushed onward. But then something changed that could not be reconciled by mechanical malfunction. The plane, for no reason he could perceive, began to drift off its assigned trajectory. He made micro-corrections, rudder, aileron, but the drift persisted. It was as though an invisible hand guided the aircraft, tugging it off course. One moment he would attempt to bank left. The next the plane would snap back or lurch right, as though resisting his intent. His chest tightened, adrenaline creeping in. Then came a silence. His world dimmed, the engine's hum muffled, external sound dying. His thoughts grew sluggish. He stared at the controls in disbelief, his fingers hanging heavy. The sky outside looked different, warped, as though through a lens. He blinked. Time itself felt elastic. He tried to radio tower, but no signal responded. Panic threatened. He shook his head. "This can't be," he muttered. And then he heard a voice. It was calm, clear, not his own. "We are watching." The words crackled through the headset, echoing in his skull. They didn't sound mechanical, nor human. They were devoid of emotion, chilling in their simplicity. The voice didn't speak Spanish, but Spanish accented, the kind of broken cadence familiar yet alien. Rafael's breath caught. He tried to respond, Who is that?" But he could not muster the strength. A haze of confusion settled over him, his vision tunneled. He felt the yoke jerk beneath his hands, as though forced. The plane banked sharply, and in his periphery he glimpsed a gleam, something metallic, disc-shaped, hovering just outside his window. It glowed with a cold, bluish light. He gasped. The light shifted, obscured, then surged outward. The instrumentation flickered, altimeter needle spinning, heading indicator jumping. Radar contact, if any existed, would have shown nothing. He was utterly alone and entirely disoriented. In that moment, Rafael's awareness fractured. He recalls later that he drifted into a stupor, a black fog edging at his senses. The next thing he knew, he was babbling on the radio. "Help. I'm Rafael Pérez, student 82 from the Aviation School of Mexico City. Whoever is out there, please reply." His voice sounded unfamiliar, too calm, modulated. Air traffic control responded, pressing him. "Where are you?" "Identify altitude," he stammered. 7,000 feet. "I don't know where I am. I see water below." The ocean. He believed he was flying over the Pacific, though he had launched inland. Controllers tried urgently to localize him, triangulate. But no radar return. No visual contact. It was as if the plane and its pilot had vanished from conventional tracking systems. Meanwhile, Rafael's voice crackled through deafening static, then regained clarity. "We are with you. We are watching," the voice repeated, its tone even, almost bored, as though conversing with a child. Rafael tried to fight, to regain control. He twisted, pushed, pulled. But the plane moved as though in two minds, at once responsive and resistant. He glimpsed the metallic object again, closer this time, and felt a wrenching tug. The sky ruptured, light flared around him, and then darkness swallowed everything. When Rafael came to, the plane was descending. He was conscious, groggy, his ears ringing. The instrument panel showed erratic readings, some gauges dead, others spinning wildly. The plane seemed off course by hundreds of miles. He radioed again, voice shaky. "This is Perez. Mayday, direction unknown. I need assistance." A voice replied, "We read you. Please descend to safe altitude and attempt to stabilize." He obeyed, coaxing the plane downward, trying to steady the craft. Outside, cloud cover thickened, rain threatened. The plane lurched. He gripped the yoke, sweat stinging in his eyes. Eventually, the radio crackled with a controller's voice. "We track no radar, but we have visual on a small aircraft descending near Acapulco." Rafael's blood turned cold. Acapulco? He had no recollection of flying that direction. But as the coast came into view, he realized with mounting dread he was indeed approaching sea and shoreline. He prepared for an emergency landing, water below, sky heavy. The plane bucked. He scanned for safe landing zones, beach, open water, cliffs. He chose water off the coast. He set up a shallow glide, flared just before touchdown, and struck the sea in a shallow belly landing. The impact was jarring but survivable. After the plane settled, Rafael evacuated, climbed onto wings, scanning the horizon. Storm clouds boiled. No rescue appeared. He radioed distress again. "I'm safe near Acapulco coast." "Need pickup." The signal crackled. He waited. Time stretched. His mind reeled. Later, rescue arrived. He was pulled aboard a vessel, wet, trembling, incoherent. Authorities transported him to medical and flight investigators. They ran toxicology, no signs of drugs, alcohol, or physiological impairment. They tested his health, perfect cardiovascular, respiratory, neurological function. No anomalies. They questioned him. He recounted the strange drift, the voice, the object. He insisted the alien intelligence had taken control, that he had been a passenger in his own body. Officials were skeptical but disturbed. The aircraft was assessed. No mechanical failure found that could account for the extreme behavior. Control surfaces intact, hydraulics responsive, engine performance nominal. Flight data, whatever logs existed, were inconsistent with Rafael's path. How had he ended up hundreds of miles off course, over water with no radar trace? It defied explanation. Press descended. Reporters pressed him. "What happened? What did you see?" Rafael stared, exhausted. He could not explain how he had flown from Mexico City to near Acapulco unassisted. He spoke of the voice, of the cold metallic disc, of losing and regaining control. But witnesses found inconsistencies. Sometimes he said he blacked out. Sometimes he insisted he was conscious the entire time, restrained. He said he never piloted again, too traumatized. Much of the public dismissed his story as delusion or hoax. Some speculated secret military experiments, psychological breaks, hallucination induced by voltage spikes or cabin pressure anomalies. UFO enthusiasts, though, seized it as evidence of extraterrestrial interference. The case sank into fringe lore, whispered in UFO circles. The recorded radio tapes fragments survive, are considered by believers to be evidence. Changes in his tone, robotic modulation, calm phrases. "We are watching." But skeptics counter, they are easily faked or misinterpreted. Even so, something about Rafael's testimony lingers. A pilot, grounded, stripped of his career. A story that cannot be neatly dismissed because so many conventional explanations fail to account for the odd drift, the missing radar, the abrupt change in voice. Is it possible that in that cockpit, for those minutes, Rafael was no longer alone? As years passed, his name appears only in passing mentions, blogs, conspiracy forums, speculative podcasts. There is no official government dossier made public. No definitive conclusion. Rafael's life after the incident faded into obscurity. But for a few hours, somewhere above land, sky, cloud, and sea, a conversation took place. Not between pilot and tower, but between a human and something other. In the years following the strange events of that fateful flight, the Rafael Pérez Alien Incident began to take on a life of its own, woven into the larger fabric of aviation mysteries and UFO encounters that defy traditional explanation. For Rafael, the incident was not merely an episode that ended when his aircraft hit the waters off Acapulco. It was the beginning of a shadow that followed him for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke publicly after the first wave of interviews, but those who knew him best said he was never the same man again. His laughter came less often, his gaze seemed heavier, and he carried a quiet suspicion that eyes unseen still lingered above him. Rumors spread that after the official investigation closed, members of the Mexican Air Force visited Rafael privately, pressing him for further details. These men, he claimed to a close friend, weren't as interested in his feelings as they were in what exactly he remembered hearing and seeing. They asked repeatedly about the phrase, "We are watching." They wanted to know if he sensed emotion in the voice, or whether he had received any instructions beyond that. He told them truthfully that the message was flat, almost indifferent, and that he had not been commanded to do anything specific, only that the controls were seized as if his body in the aircraft had been borrowed for a brief purpose. One officer reportedly asked him, "Did they look at you? Did they acknowledge you specifically?" Rafael hesitated and said he could not tell. It was as though he was a specimen, part of an experiment, but never a participant in dialogue. They had no interest in conversation, no curiosity in his identity. He was not Rafael Pérez to them. He was simply a subject. The officers seemed unsettled by this answer. Word of this exchange filtered out into UFO research communities, adding fuel to the theory that what Pérez experienced was not random but part of a deliberate program of observation. Researchers pointed to cases in Brazil, Argentina, and even the United States where pilots reported similar interference engines cutting out, radios flooding with strange static, or hearing voices that weren't their own. In many of those cases, radar showed nothing, leaving pilots with testimony but no evidence. Rafael's account, however, was unique because he survived an incident where his body seemed directly overridden, where he was conscious but powerless. For skeptics, the more time passed, the easier it was to dismiss the event as a mix of stress and disorientation. But those who listened closely to the original transcripts of Rafael's radio calls couldn't shake the chilling transformation in his voice. In some recordings, his words sounded stretched, slowed, and oddly tonal, as if modulated by something beyond static. Phrases like, "We are safe," and "direction steady" were uncharacteristic of a frightened student pilot in a crisis. Investigators noted that his cadence during those transmissions resembled dictation, as though another intelligence was choosing his words. Psychologists later suggested dissociation, where a person under extreme stress separates from their own consciousness, speaking in a flat, disconnected manner. But those who sat with Rafael afterward insisted his recounting didn't fit that pattern. He wasn't fragmented or confused in memory. He was precise, repeating the same details without embellishment. Dissociative episodes typically leave gaps or inconsistencies, but Rafael never altered his story even years later. That consistency is what troubled many who tried to explain him away. As the incident entered the annals of UFO lore, new layers of conspiracy theories emerged. Some believed that Rafael had accidentally flown into the path of a classified military experiment, perhaps electromagnetic technology designed to disable or hijack enemy aircraft. The lack of radar trace, they suggested, might have been the result of advanced jamming equipment. In that view, the voice he heard could have been a transmission from ground or airborne operators testing voice-to-skull technology. While this theory fascinated researchers of secret military projects, it raised its own questions. Why test such technology on a student pilot in broad daylight over Mexico City? Why risk exposure with a civilian target? Others argued that the case was consistent with close encounter of the second kind classifications, where UFOs directly affect human machinery and physiology. The bluish disk he claimed to see outside his cockpit matched countless sightings of glowing metallic craft, reported across Mexico in the 1980s and 1990s. Pilots, truck drivers, and even police officers described hovering lights that interfered with radios, drained car batteries, or caused temporary paralysis. Rafael's case, they argued, was simply a more extreme manifestation of the same phenomenon. The aftermath of the Pérez incident grew even stranger when whispers emerged that NASA scientists had quietly requested copies of his medical results. According to one journalist, files were passed through intermediaries to American officials curious about why Perez's health tests had come back so perfectly normal after such an ordeal. The theory was that extraterrestrial encounters often left behind traces of radiation exposure or neurological disruption. The fact that Rafael showed none of these effects made his case anomalous, as if whatever had happened to him was not harmful but precisely controlled. In Mexico, the case remained both a curiosity and a taboo subject. Pilots who heard about Rafael's story were divided. Some scoffed, saying he was inventing a tale to cover incompetence. Others admitted quietly that they had seen strange lights themselves but never reported them, fearing ridicule. One retired pilot confessed in an interview years later that he believed Rafael's story because he too had once lost his compass and radio contact inexplicably near Veracruz, only to regain them minutes later without explanation. He never told his superiors, but after hearing Rafael's testimony, he realized the phenomena might be linked. For Rafael personally, the years passed in an uneasy silence. He never pursued aviation again. Instead, he took odd jobs, lived modestly, and avoided large gatherings. Those who visited him recalled his house filled with books on astronomy, theology, and the paranormal, as if he were endlessly searching for an answer to what had happened. He kept notebooks filled with sketches of discs, diagrams of cockpit panels, and transcriptions of the words he heard during the flight. On some pages he wrote the phrase, "We are watching," over and over, as if trying to decipher its meaning through repetition. Some described him as paranoid, checking the sky at night and keeping curtains drawn. Others said he was simply cautious, having been touched by something incomprehensible. There were rumors that he received visits from men who identified themselves as researchers, speaking English and carrying official-looking identification. They would sit with him for hours, asking the same questions over and over. Did he feel pain? Did he lose track of time? Did he notice anything unusual about the light? After these visits, Rafael would become withdrawn, as if disturbed not by aliens but by the persistence of humans who wouldn't leave him alone. UFO researchers in Mexico and abroad continued to cite the case in lectures and conferences. For them, Rafael's story was proof that extraterrestrials not only observed but could take control at will. They compared his experience to possession, but instead of spiritual or demonic, it was technological and clinical. They argued that Rafael had experienced a kind of temporary abduction, not in the sense of being taken aboard a craft, but of being momentarily integrated into an experiment where his body and plane were commandeered. To them, the Pérez incident demonstrated that humans could be puppeted without consent, a concept both fascinating and terrifying. The skeptics countered with science, pointing out that Rafael's plane had not vanished. It was found intact. They argued that claims of radar invisibility were likely exaggerations caused by coverage gaps. They suggested Rafael's voice anomalies could have been due to faulty radio transmission. Yet they could not explain why his aircraft was found so far off course, nor how a student managed to execute a water landing that many seasoned pilots would struggle to perform. Each time they tried to box the case into a neat explanation, it spilled back out into mystery. Decades later, when UFO disclosure movements gained momentum across North America, Rafael's name resurfaced. Activists pointed to his case as one of many suppressed incidents that governments quietly acknowledged behind closed doors while ridiculing publicly. In online discussions, Rafael was sometimes portrayed as a forgotten pioneer, a man who experienced what others only speculated. For Rafael himself, however, none of the attention brought peace. He admitted to a confidant that the worst part was not the flight, nor the ridicule, but the lingering sense that he had been marked. He said he often woke in the middle of the night feeling watched, as if invisible presences were checking on him. He described dreams of flying without an aircraft, gliding over oceans under a sky filled with glowing discs. In these dreams he could hear the voice again, calm, detached, always repeating, "We are watching." He wondered aloud if they had implanted something in him. Not physically, but mentally, a signal that tied him to them forever. And so the Rafael Pérez Alien Incident remained unsolved, suspended between skepticism and belief, science and speculation. It was more than just a pilot's strange tale. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's fear of losing control, of being reduced to subjects in an experiment run by a greater intelligence. The unanswered questions haunted not only Rafael but everyone who tried to make sense of what happened in that cockpit. Why did the craft intervene? Why did the voice speak so plainly? And above all, why let him survive to tell the story? By the early 2000s, the name Rafael Pérez had become a kind of ghost note in the UFO field, mentioned in hushed tones on late-night radio programs, quoted in footnotes of obscure books, yet still without a single official document released to the public. The Mexican press, which had once sensationalized his possessed pilot headline, had long since moved on to other stories. But within the subculture of researchers, the Pérez incident was a touchstone, the rare case where a pilot survived and gave direct testimony about losing control of his body and aircraft to an unknown intelligence. It became a parable for everything people feared about alien contact. Not invasion, but manipulation. Not spectacle, but a quiet erasure of agency. Around this time, a new generation of investigators began to revisit the case. With the rise of online forums and digital archives, fragments of Rafael's radio transmissions and old newspaper clippings were digitized and shared. Audio engineers analyzed the surviving tapes of his emergency calls. They slowed them down, isolated frequencies, and tried to determine whether a second, overlapping voice existed on the recordings. Some claimed to hear a faint, whispered echo behind Rafael's words, like a low electronic hum carrying syllables in an unknown language. Others dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to hear patterns in noise. But the mystery added another layer to the legend. What gave the case even more weight in these communities was its consistency with a global pattern. In 1978, Frederick Valentich vanished over the Bass Strait after radioing about a large, green-lit craft hovering over him. In 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 reported a massive UFO near Alaska. In 1994, South African Air Force pilots described an object outrunning their jets. Pérez ordeal slotted into this timeline as the Latin American possession case, a moment where, instead of just seeing a craft, a pilot felt himself used by it. In online discussions, people began referring to him as the man they flew, a grimly poetic tag that captured the unease of his story. Yet Rafael never courted fame. He lived quietly in a small apartment on the outskirts of Mexico City, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. Friends said his routine was monastic: morning coffee, long walks, evenings reading or listening to radio programs about astronomy and metaphysics. He had no social media, no desire to defend himself publicly. When a UFO documentary crew tried to interview him in 2005, he answered the door politely but declined to appear on camera. One of the producers later wrote online that Rafael's eyes looked like someone who had stared too long into a sky full of secrets. Privately, though, he remained obsessed. Visitors saw stacks of notebooks filled with diagrams of aircraft control systems and sketches of the disk he claimed had hovered outside his cockpit. In the margins he wrote the phrase, "They are still watching," in Spanish, English, and sometimes symbols that resembled code. He seemed to be trying to translate or decode something from memory. He also kept a folder of letters from people who said they had similar experiences. Truck drivers who lost time on the highway, fishermen who woke up miles from where they cast their nets, even a nurse who claimed a voice guided her car out of an accident. Rafael rarely replied, but he read every letter. In the meantime, conspiracy theories about his case proliferated. Some argued that Rafael had been the target of a joint U.S.-Mexican military experiment in remote piloting, using microwave or low-frequency transmissions to override his motor functions. Others believed he had been deliberately steered toward Acapulco because an underwater UFO base lay off the coast, one of the many USOs, unidentified submersible objects, reported by fishermen there. Still others thought the entire event was staged to test public reaction to alien contact stories. The lack of hard evidence allowed each theory to grow unchallenged. The government silence didn't help. Every request for documents filed under Mexico's Freedom of Information law came back with no responsive records. The aviation school said they had lost the training files. The Mexican Air Force said it had no involvement. The tapes of his transmissions survived only as copies passed hand-to-hand among enthusiasts. That void of official data gave the incident an almost mythic quality. People began to treat it less as an event to solve and more as a modern legend, something true and not true at the same time, echoing in the space between belief and disbelief. International researchers began comparing the psychological profiles of pilots involved in UFO encounters. Most, they noted, were highly trained, disciplined, and reluctant to speak. Perez fit that profile in some ways. He had been a serious student, not prone to fantasy, but he also differed. He was younger, less experienced, and flying a small plane, making him both a more vulnerable target and a less credible witness to skeptics. Some theorists suggested this was deliberate. Entities interested in testing their ability to override human control would choose someone like Rafael precisely because he sat at the margins of institutional power. If something went wrong, his story could be dismissed as a young man's confusion. In the Mexican UFO community, however, he was regarded almost as a folk hero. At conferences, people would show his photograph next to grainy stills of supposed disc-shaped craft. Speakers invoked his name in lectures about non-consensual pilot integration and temporary alien embodiment. They speculated about what it must feel like to have one's body moved like a puppet. The more dramatic presenters called him the first documented case of alien piloting. For attendees, the Pérez incident was a warning. If they can take control of an aircraft, what else could they commandeer? Despite the dramatic framing, the quiet facts of Rafael's life after the incident were more poignant than sensational. He developed a habit of sleeping with a light on, saying the darkness reminded him of the moment the cockpit dimmed. He never married, though he had once been engaged. Friends said he broke off the relationship because he feared they might come back and didn't want anyone else caught up in it. In one rare conversation with a journalist, he said softly, "I didn't survive because I was lucky. I survived because they let me." That's not the same thing, as UFO disclosure gained traction in the United States around 2017. And beyond, with Navy videos of unidentified aerial phenomena released to the public, Rafael's case began trending again in Spanish-language media. Podcasts invited researchers to retell his story. YouTube channels made animated reconstructions of his flight path, showing the sudden deviation from Mexico City to the coast. Comment sections filled with debates between believers and skeptics. For younger audiences, Pérez was almost a new name. Discovered in the digital era and recast as a kind of Latin American Mulder, a man who had glimpsed the truth but been sidelined. One of the strangest developments came when an independent lab claimed to have analyzed electromagnetic anomalies in the region off Acapulco, where Rafael ditched his plane. Using magnetometers and sonar, the group said they detected unusual readings consistent with a large metallic mass beneath the seafloor. They speculated it could be a sunken ship or natural formation, but UFO forums exploded with claims of an underwater base. Though the lab's report was inconclusive, it reignited interest in whether Rafael had been steered toward that spot intentionally. Was the craft guiding him there to mark a location? Was it a rescue, an interception, or something else entirely? Through all this, Rafael stayed silent. He refused interview requests, ignored documentary crews, and declined invitations to conferences. A friend said he once murmured, "Every time I talk about it, they come back in my dreams." That was enough to keep him away from the spotlight. He spent his days reading, writing notes, and sometimes traveling to quiet coastal towns where he could watch the sea. He told one confidant that he felt safest near water, as if the ocean somehow dampened whatever presence had touched him. What kept the story alive wasn't just the strangeness of the flight, but the haunting ordinariness of Rafael's life afterward. He wasn't a showman or a charlatan. He didn't sell books or go on lecture tours. He simply tried to exist, to live with the knowledge that for a brief period he had been a passenger in his own body. That authenticity, paradoxically, made his story harder to dismiss. People sensed he carried something heavy, even if they didn't believe in aliens. As the decades rolled on, the Pérez incident began to function like a cultural mirror. For some, it symbolized government secrecy. For others, it reflected the fragility of human autonomy in a technological world. For believers, it was a milestone in our slow, reluctant realization that we are not alone. For skeptics, it was a cautionary tale about how easily narrative can fill the gaps of uncertainty. And for Rafael himself, it was simply the moment his life split into before and after, a wound that never closed. Even now, when people discuss Latin America's most puzzling UFO cases, his name rises alongside them. The details may be debated, the evidence inconclusive, but the story endures because it touches something primal: the fear of being watched, the terror of losing control, and the unresolved question of what exactly moves in the skies above us. When Rafael looks up at night, if he still does, he might not be searching for proof. He might just be waiting, wondering whether the calm voice that once said, "We are watching," will one day speak again. Time has a way of smoothing the rough edges of memory, but for Rafael Pérez the years never dulled the vividness of what happened in that cockpit. Even in his later life, long after newspapers had forgotten his name, the incident continued to live inside him like an echo that refused to fade. People close to him said that when he grew older he would sometimes sit quietly by a window in the evening, staring at the sky not with wonder but with a kind of weary familiarity, as though he expected at any moment to hear that same voice again. The public continued to revisit his story, often reshaped for new audiences. In UFO documentaries, he became a symbol of what some called the silent abduction, a form of contact where no spacecraft beams a person aboard and no dramatic encounter occurs, but where something invisible still exerts its control. Researchers argued that Perez's case revealed a truth hidden behind many reports, that aliens, if they exist, may not need to abduct or terrorize. They may simply observe, test, and release, leaving the witness to struggle with the aftermath. For skeptics, his story remained a puzzle that refused to lock into place. They pointed out that flight records were inconsistent, that his aircraft should not have had the range to reach Acapulco, and that without verifiable radar data, the entire episode relied on the word of a single man. But what unsettled them was the detail of his water landing. Pilots with decades of experience admitted that belly landing a small plane on the sea without flipping or breaking apart required precision and composure. How could a frightened student, supposedly hallucinating or disoriented, manage such a feat? This contradiction gnawed at the logical explanations. The mystery deepened when whispers began to circulate of private recordings, longer versions of Rafael's transmissions than the snippets that made it to the public. According to some insiders, these tapes contained several minutes where Rafael's voice alternated between panicked Spanish and calm, oddly measured statements that seemed out of place. Some words were repeated like commands, others drifted into monotone reassurances about safety and direction. Supposed existence of these tapes became a legend in itself, with enthusiasts claiming they proved Rafael had been overtaken. Whether these recordings were real or not, their rumor alone was enough to cement the case as one of the strangest in aviation lore. In his personal life, Rafael never regained the trajectory he had lost. His dream of being a professional pilot dissolved. He took on work in mechanical repair and spent years keeping to himself. He was neither bitter nor angry, but friends said he carried a quiet resignation, as if he had accepted that some forces were simply beyond human reach. He never sought money from his story, never wrote a book, never gave lectures. If anything, he avoided the limelight at all costs. That choice gave his account an authenticity that many found persuasive. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Yet he never changed his story. As global interest in UFOs surged again in the 2020s, fueled by declassified reports and pilot testimonies from around the world, younger researchers rediscovered Rafael's incident. They placed it alongside modern accounts of unexplained aerial phenomena, pointing out that the technology described by pilots decades ago, instantaneous acceleration, radar invisibility, electromagnetic interference, remained consistent over time. Perez's testimony about his loss of control was reframed as a warning of what advanced intelligence could do if it chose: override not just machines but human will. For believers, his case illustrated a fundamental vulnerability. Humans are not the masters of their skies. They are tenants, observed by landlords who occasionally remind them of their place. The phrase, "we are watching," became a rallying cry in UFO communities, a chilling reminder that observation itself can be invasive. The idea that unseen intelligences could take control of a plane, steer a body, and return it unharmed suggested a technology or ability so far beyond ours that it resembled possession or divine intervention. It was not violence, but it was domination, a reminder of power. For Rafael, the years of silence did not mean healing. He told one confidant that he still dreamed of blue light and metallic discs. In these dreams he was never flying. He was always sitting in the cockpit while invisible hands moved the controls. Sometimes he heard the voice again. Not always in words, but in impressions, feelings of being catalogued, as if he were a specimen in a vast experiment. He woke from these dreams sweating, sometimes weeping, sometimes whispering, "They let me live. They let me." Those who knew him said he never considered himself chosen, only used. Toward the end of his life, he admitted in private letters that he often wondered why he had been spared. Other pilots had vanished without a trace. their planes lost to the sea or to the silence of unsolved mysteries. He survived, yet survival brought its own torment. He once wrote, "The cruelest thing is not to disappear. The cruelest thing is to return with no answers." Those words were later quoted by researchers as the most human summary of the alien phenomenon, a reminder that knowledge withheld is a wound in itself. The legend of the Rafael Pérez Alien Incident endures because it refuses closure. Unlike other cases where debris, radar confirmation, or multiple witnesses might tip the scale one way or another, this story remains balanced on the fragile truth of a single man's experience. To some, that makes it unconvincing. To others, it makes it hauntingly pure. It is not cluttered by spectacle, not bolstered by sensational claims. It is one pilot, one flight, one inexplicable intrusion that rerouted the rest of his life. Today, his name surfaces in discussions of aviation anomalies, alongside Valentich and other pilots who reported encounters. The difference is that Perez survived to tell his tale. That survival, paradoxically, leaves us with more questions than answers. What did the craft want? Why take control of a student pilot in a training flight? Why deliver him unharmed to the sea instead of letting him crash? And why speak only those 3 words, calm and detached? "We are watching." Perhaps the greatest weight of the story lies in its ordinariness. Rafael was not famous, not a military officer, not a figure of power. He was a student, an everyman who loved the sky. His story reminds us that encounters with the unknown are not reserved for generals or presidents. They happen to ordinary people, in ordinary moments, and those people are often left alone to grapple with the enormity of it. In the end, the Perez incident is not just about aliens, UFOs, or governments hiding secrets. It is about the fragility of human control and the unsettling possibility that we are subjects of observation we cannot refuse. For Rafael, the incident was the dividing line of his existence. Before, he was a young man with dreams of aviation. After, he was a witness marked forever by the realization that the sky is not empty and autonomy is not guaranteed. When the story is told today, whether in whispered late-night conversations, in podcasts, or in online threads, it carries the same eerie resonance it had decades ago. A man took to the air, confident and eager, only to return with a truth he never sought. That someone, somewhere is watching, waiting, and reminding us of how little we truly understand. The case may never be resolved, but its power lies not in proof, but in presence. Every time Rafael's story is retold, it becomes part of a larger human narrative about mystery, control, and the vast unknown. And somewhere, if Rafael was right, the watchers still observe, silent and patient, their message unchanged. We are watching.